On the morning of the 19th of July, 1821, the legal Queen Consort of the United Kingdom was refused entry to her own husband's coronation. Bayonets were lowered toward her at the door. A deputy chamberlain slammed it shut in her face. 19 days later, she was dead. Most people file Caroline of Brunswick under wronged wife, but the truth is far uglier, because she wasn't the only one in that marriage willing to burn the monarchy down. She was born on the 17th of May, 1768, in Brunswick, a small German duchy with a big military reputation. Her father was Charles William Ferdinand, the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a soldier prince of real European standing. Her mother was Princess Augusta of Great Britain, the sister of King George III. That made Caroline the King of England's niece, and it made the boy she would eventually marry her first cousin. Her childhood was strange in a very specific way. She was watched constantly and taught almost nothing useful. Court gossip about her was already unkind by her teens. Too loud, too blunt, too physical, too eager to say the thing everyone else was carefully not saying. Some of that reputation was pure snobbery. Some of it was accurate. Caroline talked the way people actually talk, which is a catastrophic personality trait if the job you are being raised for is professional silence. Nobody in Brunswick was preparing her for London. Nobody was preparing her for the man either, because the marriage that defined her entire life was never about her. It was about money. By 1794, George, Prince of Wales, was 32 years old and financially underwater in a way that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. His debts ran to roughly £630,000, a private overdraft, the size of a government department, run up on architecture, tailoring, horses, and interior decoration. Parliament was not inclined to hand a grown man that much cash for nothing, so a deal was struck. He would get his debts covered and his income raised, and in exchange he would do the one thing he had been avoiding: marry a Protestant princess and produce a legitimate heir. There was a complication. George was already married. In 1785, he had secretly wed Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow he appears to have genuinely loved. Under British law, that marriage was invalid. It had no royal consent, and she was Catholic, so officially it had never happened. Unofficially, everyone knew, which meant the woman about to be shipped over from Germany wasn't just a stranger. She was the price of a bailout, standing in a position his actual wife already occupied. Caroline was the living receipt for the worst financial decisions of his life. He never once let her forget it. The man sent to fetch her was Lord Malmesbury, a career diplomat who arrived in Brunswick in late 1794 and immediately understood that he had a problem. His diary, one of the most useful and most brutal documents in this entire story, records him trying to coach a grown princess in personal hygiene. He raised the subject of washing. He raised the subject of clean linen. He raised it more than once. Court standards in a modest German duchy were simply not the standards of the most fashion-obsessed prince in Europe, and Malmesbury could see exactly where this was heading. He got her onto a ship at Cuxhaven on the 28th of March, 1795. She landed at Greenwich on the 5th of April. And the first thing England did to Caroline of Brunswick was make her wait at a door. Nobody was there to meet her. The welcoming party was late. When it finally arrived, the woman appointed as her lady of the bedchamber, the senior attendant who would live beside her, handle her correspondence, and control her access to her husband, was Frances Villiers, Countess of Jersey, George's mistress, installed inside his bride's household on day one. The saboteur was in the room before the marriage even started. 3 days later, on the 8th of April 1795, they married at the Chapel Royal, St. James's Palace. What happened when they first met is recorded in Malmesbury's diary, and it is one of the great disastrous first impressions in royal history. George embraced her, walked away, and asked for a drink. Malmesbury wrote down the line, ***, I am not well, pray get me a glass of brandy." That was the marriage. Everything after it was just detail. Contemporary accounts describe a groom who was heavily intoxicated at the ceremony itself, propped up and steered through his vows. There are reports that he spent the wedding night collapsed in the fireplace grate, though the more lurid versions of that night come from hostile sources and can't be confirmed. What can be confirmed is the mutual revulsion and the speed of it. Two people met, took one look at each other, and privately decided this would be war. And yet the marriage worked exactly once. That was all it needed to. Princess Charlotte Augusta was born on the 7th of January 1796, precisely 9 months after the wedding. She was healthy, she was legitimate, and she was second in line to the British throne. George had delivered the heir Parliament paid for, which meant Caroline had now completed the entirety of her assigned function in British public life. At the age of 27, 3 months later, he sent her a letter formally ending the relationship. In it, he set out, in writing, that they would never live as husband and wife again. He was done. She had another 25 years to go. Caroline moved out to Blackheath, taking a house at Montague House, and here the story takes a turn that nobody at Carlton House anticipated. Cut loose from court, she started doing whatever she liked. She held her own gatherings. She said what she thought about her husband to anyone who would listen, and quite a lot of people wanted to listen. She took in local children in need and paid for their care. And the public. This is the part George never understood. The public adored her for it. He had a wife he could exile from his household. He could not exile her from the newspapers. Every year that he grew fatter, more expensive, and more openly contemptuous of her, she grew more sympathetic by simple contrast. The most debt-ridden prince in Europe had accidentally created his own opposition candidate, and she was living 6 miles away, entertaining the neighbors. So he went looking for something he could use. In 1802, Caroline took in an infant named William Austen, the son of Sophia Austen, a labourer's wife. It was the kind of thing she did constantly. It was also in the wrong hands, ammunition. The wrong hands belonged to Sir John and Lady Douglas, former friends turned informants. From 1805, Lady Douglas began telling anyone who mattered that Caroline had confessed the boy was her own, and that she had been sleeping with a series of men. An illegitimate child born to the Princess of Wales wasn't gossip. It was a constitutional grenade. In 1806, King George III authorized a secret commission of 4 senior lords to investigate his own niece and daughter-in-law. It is known, with magnificent understatement, as the delicate investigation. There was nothing delicate about it. Servants were interviewed. Households were combed. Sophia Austen was called and testified that the child was hers, her own son born to her, exactly as everyone in Blackheath had always assumed. The commissioners reported that the birth allegation had asterisks, no foundation. They also found the adultery charges unproven, but they didn't clear her cleanly. They added a sting in the report. Her general behavior, they said, had invited very unfavorable interpretations. Translated out of legal English, that means, we can't prove any of it. And she absolutely should have known better. George III accepted the findings. His son did not. And the Prince of Wales now had something more valuable than proof. He had a template. Get the servants, get the statements. Try again later. The one thing missing from all of this was any real sense of how frightening it must have been to live inside it. That arrived 2 centuries later. In the early 2020s, Cambridge University Library acquired the Massey Beresford Archive, a body of private papers, including letters and a handwritten poem connected to the circle around Caroline in this period. It doesn't rewrite the facts of the 1806 investigation, and nobody has claimed it does. What it adds is atmosphere. Material reflecting the pressure applied to people close to her, the approaches made to her household, the sense of a woman surrounded by staff who might have been collecting evidence against her. The paperwork already said she was investigated. The letters make it feel like she was hunted. But the cruelest weapon in George's hands wasn't a spy. It was their daughter. Access to Charlotte was restricted, then restricted further. Caroline saw her child under supervision, on terms set entirely by the man who dizzed her. When George became Prince Regent in 1811, his father having sunk into permanent illness, the restrictions tightened again. He now held the powers of the crown. And one of the things he used them for was managing the visiting hours of a mother and daughter who lived in the same city. Charlotte grew up as the rope in a tug-of-war between 2 adults who cared more about winning than about her. By 1814, Caroline had had enough of England. On the 8th of August, she left, under an arrangement that gave her an annual allowance. Initially £35,000, to conduct her life somewhere that wasn't within scandal distance of Carlton House. It was the single worst decision she ever made. It also briefly made her happy. She traveled the continent for years. Italy, Greece, North Africa, the Holy Land. Her household was managed by an Italian named Bartolomeo Pergami, hired first as a courier and promoted to chamberlain, a spectacular rise for a man of his background, and one that got noticed by everyone. What was actually going on between them is the great unanswerable question of her life. Witnesses would later testify to shared rooms, to traveling arrangements that looked like a couple's rather than an employer's. Some of her own supporters privately believed the relationship was sexual. Others pointed out that the witnesses were being paid by her husband's agents, which is not a detail that improves testimony. She was never convicted of anything and will likely never know the truth. What can be dismissed outright is the rest of it, the caricature version, the prints and pamphlets showing her half-naked at continental balls. That material comes from hostile satirists funded by her enemies, and no reliable eyewitness account supports it. That was propaganda, not history. While she was abroad, the worst news of her life reached her in the worst possible way. In November 1817, Princess Charlotte died in childbirth. She was 21. Britain went into an outpouring of grief so enormous that shops closed and drapers ran out of black cloth. Caroline found out from a passing courier. Nobody in the British government or the royal household had thought it necessary to formally inform the mother that her only child was dead. That was the moment the last thread snapped. There was no longer a daughter to fight over, no heir binding them. Nothing left between Caroline and George except 22 years of accumulated hatred, and the legal fact of a marriage neither of them wanted. And then, on the 29th of January 1820, King George III died. His son became King George IV, which meant that a woman traveling around the Mediterranean with an Italian chamberlain automatically, instantly, and without anyone's permission, became Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. The new king's response was immediate. He wanted her gone, not just physically, but legally, permanently erased. Her name was left out of the prayers for the royal family in church services, which sounds like a technicality and was, in fact, a public announcement, repeated every Sunday in every parish that the Queen did not exist. His government tried money first. Caroline was offered £50,000 a year, a colossal income guaranteed for life, to stay in Europe and drop all claim to the title. She turned it down. Think about what that decision actually was. She chose to give up a fortune in order to sail toward a country where the head of state was actively assembling a case to destroy her. She chose the fight over the money. Whether that was courage or self-destruction is the question that hangs over everything that follows. In June 1820, she landed in England. The crowds that met her were enormous, loud, and openly hostile to the king. Radicals, reformers, and ordinary Londoners who loathed George IV had found their figurehead, and she was more than happy to be one. She rode through cheering streets, while her husband sat in a palace listening to it. He responded by putting her on trial for adultery in the House of Lords. The instrument was the Bill of Pains and Penalties, introduced in the summer of 1820. If passed, it would dissolve the marriage and strip her of the title of Queen. The evidence came from the Milan Commission. A team George's people had sent to Italy specifically to buy, coax, and collect testimony about Pergami from her former staff. And here is the irony that broke over Britain like a wave. This trial was run at the pleasure of George IV, a man whose mistresses were a matter of public record, who had contracted an illegal secret marriage, and whose personal spending had required a parliamentary bailout. The most notoriously debauched prince in Europe had built a public tribunal to examine his wife's morals. The glass house had thrown the first stone and then invited the entire nation in to watch. Her defense was led by Henry Brougham, and what he did in that chamber was surgical. He got hold of the king's Italian witnesses and took them apart. The most famous was Theodore Maggiocchi, who under cross-examination retreated again and again into the same three words: asterisk. Non mi ricordo. I don't remember. It became a national catchphrase within days. It was printed on cartoons, shouted in the street, and used as a punchline in pubs. The prosecution's star witness had become the funniest thing in England. Outside Westminster, London was close to ungovernable. Crowds massed daily. Soldiers were kept close. Brougham's real weapon was never legal. It was the very obvious fact that the mob outside would not accept a conviction, and that the government knew it. The bill passed its second reading by a majority so narrow that it was effectively a defeat. On the 10th of November 1820, the government abandoned it entirely. Note what that was and what it wasn't. She was never acquitted. There was no verdict of innocence, no judicial finding in her favor. The government simply looked at the numbers, looked at the streets, and dropped the case because pursuing it might cost them the country. But the public didn't care about the technicality. London erupted. There were illuminations, fireworks, and days of celebration, and the message underneath the party was unmistakable. The king had spent a fortune and his last shred of dignity trying to divorce his wife, and he had lost in front of everyone. The following spring, a messenger arrived with news from the South Atlantic. Napoleon Bonaparte had died on St. Helena. According to contemporary courtiers, the messenger announced that His Majesty's greatest enemy was dead, and George immediately replied, asterisk, "Is she, by God?" The story is reported rather than documented, and it may well have been polished in the retelling. But it captures something true. The man who had reigned through the final defeat of Napoleon considered his real war to be the one against his own wife. And that war had one battle left. The coronation was set for the 19th of July, 1821, and George IV intended it to be the most magnificent in British history. He wanted to outdo Napoleon's. Contemporary estimates put the cost at somewhere around £238,000 to £243,000 for a single day, from a man whose debts had once required an Act of Parliament to clear. There were costumes, a banquet in Westminster Hall, and a train so long it required attendance. There was no seat for the Queen. Caroline announced that she would attend anyway. She was the legal Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, and she wanted to be crowned beside him, which in her position was either magnificent defiance or a complete misreading of the room. Possibly both. Her chamberlain, Lord Hood, wrote formally to the Duke of Norfolk, requesting arrangements for the Queen's attendance. The reply came back in the flat language of court refusal. It was asterisk, not His Majesty's pleasure. She pushed. So the government reached for the law. On the 10th and 11th of July, a committee of the Privy Council who formally ruled that a Queen Consort has no legal right to be crowned at all. That a consort's coronation is a matter of the sovereign's favour, and nothing more. It was not invented for her, and it was not illegal. It was simply a very old rule, dusted off at exactly the right moment, and pointed at exactly one woman. Every legal door had now been closed. She decided to try the physical ones. She went. And by the following morning, the Queen of England was dying. The illness began the night of the 19th. She took milk of magnesia, then laudanum, and by the small hours she was in severe abdominal pain. It did not pass. Over the next 2.5 weeks, she deteriorated steadily while her physicians attended her at Brandenburg House in Hammersmith, and reached the same grim conclusion: an intestinal obstruction. Some believed there was cancer underneath it. No autopsy report survives that could settle it. She knew what was happening. Contemporary memoirs record her saying near the end, "Asterisk, I am going to die, but it does not matter." That is the sentence of a woman who had spent 26 years being fought over, and had finally stopped caring who won. She spent part of her last days destroying things. Letters, memoirs, private papers, years of accumulated documentation burned. Whatever was in them, whatever they proved or disproved about Pergami or the Dugzazes or the king, went into the fire on her instructions. No historian has ever seen them. She died at Brandenburg House at 25 minutes past 10 on the night of the 7th of August, 1821. She was 53 years old. Within days, London had decided she'd been poisoned. It was an accusation, aimed straight at the king and his ministers, and it was entirely understandable. She had been humiliated in public, and 19 days later she was in a coffin. But there is no evidence for it whatsoever. No toxicology, no suspicious finding. Nothing but suspicion and timing. Her physicians recorded a natural death consistent with obstruction, and that remains the only medical account there is. Whether the humiliation itself helped kill her is a different question, and an unanswerable one. The illness began that same night. Everything beyond that is speculation dressed as certainty. So, back to the morning of the 19th of July, 1821, and what actually happened at those doors. She arrived at Westminster Hall at around 6 in the morning, accompanied by Lord Hood, having been up before dawn to be there in time. The route to the coronation was ticketed and lined with soldiers. She had no ticket because the king had refused to issue her one. She went to the first door and was refused. She was the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, and a doorkeeper told her she couldn't come in without a ticket. She tried another entrance, refused again. A side door was slammed shut. Witnesses describe soldiers with bayonets held at her chin, men who had been given orders and were not going to be talked out of them by a woman with no paperwork. She did not give up. She was driven round to the Abbey and tried the Poets' Corner entrance. There, Lord Hood produced his own ticket and offered it to her. But the ticket admitted one person. Only one. So the Queen of England was told she could enter her husband's coronation alone, unattended, as an anonymous guest slipping in on a borrowed pass, or not at all. And that was the moment she stopped. She refused to go in like that. A deputy chamberlain slammed the heavy doors in her face, and from the crowd came shouts of "Shame!" Then she got back into her carriage and went home. Inside the Abbey, her husband was being crowned in front of a congregation who had all heard the noise outside. And it kept going after she was dead. Her will contained an instruction about her coffin plate. It was to read, "Here lies Caroline, the injured Queen of England." British officials refused to allow the plate to be fixed while her body remained in their custody. The King's government objecting to 9 words on a metal plate on a corpse. Her funeral procession was so contentious that the crowd physically forced it to take a different route through the city. And when soldiers fired on the crowd at Cumberland Gate, 2 men were killed. 2 more deaths for a woman who was already in a box. Her executors waited. The coffin was shipped to Brunswick, out of British jurisdiction, and interred in the cathedral on the 25th of August, 1821, with a version of her inscription on it after all. George IV spent £250,000 to buy the most magnificent coronation in British history, and he got one. It's simply that nobody remembers a single thing about it, except the sound of a door slamming on his wife. Was Caroline of Brunswick a woman denied the crown that was legally hers, or a woman who chose humiliation over a fortune because destroying her husband mattered more to her than her own dignity? Thanks for watching History's Hidden Lives. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us.